Good evening. I'm Norman Hamilton. Welcome to Conversations. Joining me this evening on the panel is Dr. Ewing Menzies, John Phillips, current member of the House of Assembly, and former Speaker of the House of Assembly, O'Neill Delancey. Our special guest is Lyndon Gardner, founder and CEO of Intercaribbean Airways. Lyndon, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you very much for having me, Norman.
Yeah, very nice to have you here, Lyndon.
Same here, Doc.
And we spent a day together recently in Cuba on your company's inaugural flight through Santo Domingo to Havana. Well
Yes.
done, and I've enjoyed some of the stories. I've known you for well over 25 years, and your family. And actually, you've been a patient, and you've allowed me to divulge some of your medical information. In that, about 20 odd years ago, I had to go and look it up on your file when we got back from Cuba. You actually were a little bit careless underneath your bonnet of your car, and you took off the top of 2 fingers. And reminded me that I'd said to you at the time there was a 50% chance, and you still have them.
Yes, I've got
Although
it.
they look a little bit distorted, but they've served you well, I think.
And they function well.
Anyway, what we're interested tonight is entrepreneurship. And one thing that I learnt, and really, and I hadn't spent time with you like that before, was how successful you've been in your current operation. And you now run Intercaribbean Airways, which is the third biggest employer in the Turks and Caicos Islands.
Yes.
And it really takes some courage and some guts to do that, what you've achieved from what I remember in your days where you had 1 and then 2 planes as Inter-Island Airways. But what we're really interested in tonight for our viewers is to actually get to the core of who you are and how you've achieved like that from really quite modest beginnings. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, Doc, quite frankly, I like telling my stories because it is a story that, particularly for the young people, resonates with them. And I think it serves to provide some encouragement and to demonstrate to them that if I can do it, having regard for my background and my education, that they can do it too. As you know, I grew up in Bottle Creek. I remember going to school bare feet, and when I didn't go bare feet, I had 1 or 2 wampus that was made of little tire. I don't know what they call them these days. I believe my mom, before she passed away, she reminded me about the Jesus slippers. So, so that was one of the names that it got. But it has not been an easy walk for me. In fact, it's been quite involved to get to the stage I am. Certainly something that took a lot of dedication, and having come from a small island, I've had to get used to a lot of planning, because obviously planning is not something that we do here on a regular basis. But I've been fortunate enough, and together with the support of my family and my larger family, which is my employees, who've really supported not only myself, but supported the business into getting to the stage we are today. Having come from the 1-engine plane hustling between Provo and North Caicos and Pine Key, to eventually getting a certificate in 1992, and then obtaining schedule rights in 2003, to fast forward that to 2013, when we finally changed the name to Intercaribbean and begin to focus actually on connecting the Caribbean. And I think that has been quite an exciting development for me personally, not only for the business and having a small business that you've nurtured, but actually having achieved substantial business that actually benefits a lot of people. And as you know me, I'm one that believe in giving back and whatever and wherever you can. So that's been especially rewarding for me. talking about some of the employees and the number of employees. I would remind you, I'm sure you know, but our company is headquartered right here in the Turks and Caicos. We have offices in 14 countries, and our business expands over 26 cities. So coming from, a little bare feet guy in Bottle Creek, I think it's a great achievement. I'm very pleased of the success story, and I hope that others, I hope we get to some of them tonight, but I'd like to share my story as well with a lot of young people.
You shared with me a lovely little story about one of the grandfathers of aviation in the Turks and Caicos, and that was about Howard Hamilton. And how, when you were starting off, you mentioned about one plane or two planes, I think you had at the time, and a lesson that you learned that has borne you in good stead since. Can you share that with us and with our viewers?
Well, it's quite funny, and I'm surprised that you actually remember that. But it's certainly one of my better stories, and is one that I take a lot of pride in repeating, because it has had, quite frankly, a very profound impact on my life and on my business. And when I say on my business, probably is better to say on the way that I do business, because Mr. Hamilton, he was quite successful in his own right with aviation, quite involved, and I think he had made a decision that he was going to be exiting the aviation scene and getting more and more into the he was running a food store at the time, and so he had made a decision to divest in his aviation fuel portfolio. I couldn't afford the planes back then, so it was just one truck pumping avgas. I made a deal with him that I will buy the truck, and he obviously
He gave
me terms. Poor Mr. Hamilton. But the terms he gave me were fairly reasonable. There was not much discussion about it, because I think in his own mind he saw me as someone that was up and coming, and he wanted to basically ensure that I was successful in his own way. So I accepted the deal from him. It was that I would just make some monthly payments, rather some weekly payments, and I'll get the thing paid for in a reasonable space of time. So it started off, as all things starts off, being very good and very much on time and making all the payments. And then I had one or two inconveniences, and of course, when you have those kind of things, your mind immediately thinks, well, what can I not pay now, and so that I can have the funds to pay something else. As it turned out, Mr. Hamilton's loan was in default. But he was a very gracious man. He was a very good friend of my mom, and he thought to himself, I'm sure, well, I better teach this young man a lesson. So at the time, we had about 2 airplanes, and I still had my little Cessna 172. Fortunately, the guy that was doing the fueling, he had worked for Howard for some almost 12 years or so. So Howard kind of had a little bit more pressure on this guy, or a little bit more influence on this guy than I did. He ordered the guy to go ahead and fuel all my airplanes, so that at least I wouldn't have any immediate inconvenience of canceling flights and so on. Went ahead and flew, and when I was gone on one of my flights, he ordered the guy to take the truck and park it at his supermarket, which a lot of the older folks will know was the Quality supermarket. So I went about my business, and I came in and I said, well, I need some fuel. And he says, so the driver says, well, he used to call me Boss Linden. He said, well, Boss Linden, I'm sorry the truck's not here. So I said, well, what's wrong with the truck? He says, I don't know. Boss Howard told me bring truck to the store. So I said, well, I don't know what he'll need an avgas truck in his store for. So let me go and see him. So I went to see Mr. Howard, as sometimes we call him, the Great Kabuki. And he said to me, he invited me very calmly in his office and sat me down and made me feel comfortable. And he says, brother man, when are you going to pay me my money? So I said to him, well, I don't have any money to pay. Things have been a little bit rough and this and that and the other. And he said, well, why can't you just tell me that? And I said to him, well, I figured, well, you would understand and so on. He said, I can't understand something that I don't know. So, we get to converse a little bit. And then finally he said to me, he said, look, I don't need the truck. And as far as I'm concerned, here's the keys. But you need to understand one thing. If you get into a problem, this is a business relationship, you need to pay me. And if you can't pay me, then you need to tell me, look, I can't pay you now, and make some kind of arrangements as to when you can pay. So he was very kind in that respect. As I said, he had all the rights under the agreement, which was basically not even a paper agreement. It was just a handshake, and he had all the agreements. He still had the truck in his name and everything else, and he could have just taken it, and that would have been the end of it. But I think giving me the truck back proved to be more valuable of a teaching for me in my life, because as the years roll along, there's been many, many instances where I've been unable to make payments, or certainly not in the amounts that were originally committed to. And so, you learn at that stage that you need to speak up and tell people, look, I can't do this now. I'm going to need some more time. I'm going to need to make smaller payments until I get to the end of it. And all those things are very valuable in terms of first of all, getting and maintaining credibility, which is the number one thing, as you would know, in business. You have to be credible, and people have to have confidence in your words and that you will perform. So that was a great story, and certainly a great experience for me. One I'll never forget, and one that the results of that I've actually used many of occasions to great success.
And you've carried it forward with you to rather larger deals that you've done.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Very big organisation now.
Well, it is, and sometimes, Doc, even myself, I marvel, because when I grew up in North Caicos, I never imagined that, one of my faintest idea was that one day I would become a pilot. But to be in the position I'm in today, which is not only the owner, but one of the driving forces behind the development of the company. It is quite impressive. Like I said, it impresses me sometimes. And I think we're just scratching the surface. There's certainly a lot more that the company is capable of doing. We're in a niche market in terms of scheduled airline services in the Caribbean. And I think the company has a great future.
Can I go a little bit to the side and just ask O'Neill whether he ever experienced those tyre sandals? I know you went to North Caicos to high school there. Maybe not quite the same era.
Well, I've known London for a very long time. It's funny because I say this, and I hope the audience don't take it wrong. London, myself, and two other young men at my age then, he was much younger than us, used to sleep in a queen-size bed cross-way when I was in high school. So we go way back. The tire shoes you're talking about, I'm aware of those. Mm-hmm. From, I can't say that I've worn them, but I'm aware of what he's talking about. There were a number of persons when I was a youngster growing up in Kew Township, who wore those as slippers. You would take a bit of a
Wampus.
You would they would take a bit of the tire itself, and cut it out, and you'll make a sole for slippers, and then you'd use some rope or whatever to make the balance of it, so it attached to your feet.
Mm. Do you remember that from middle at all, Norm?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it was
Yeah,
pretty
anybody
common.
our age will group will remember those. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty common in those days. And the thing about it, they last 50 times longer than a regular shoe.
Right.
But
As long as they were Dunlop or some regular
Not by much.
brand.
Not by much.
But did they have cars in your day?
Of course.
Well, he was in Provo. They had cars in the
They did have cars in my day. Actually, 1968 in Q, I was living in Q, North Caicos. And they had cars and trucks in Q. There was an old man. There was a man called Mr. Wins who, he had a number of Volkswagen Beetles in his yard. Most of them wasn't working, but they were there.
Was that before? I remember seeing the video of Tommy Coleman's at his obituary. There was a little vehicle that Provident brought on board in 1968, and it was claimed to be the first car. So might there have been other cars already here? There was no real airstrip, was there?
We must remember that Providenciales was the last island in the Turks and Caicos chain to see any development, to see cars and modern vehicles and see modern life.
There would have been vehicles in Grand Turks, South Caicos places long before that.
We must understand that. In 1968, I flew out of Freeport, Bahamas into South Caicos it was British Airways. It was the British Airways called BOTC or something like that.
BOAC.
British
Was the
Overseas
same
Airways
now as the
Corporation.
British Airways, okay? That service these areas in parts of Africa and other British overseas territories. So yes, just to make the point, Provo, we must understand, was the last of the islands to see modern development if you take it back to 1960s.
Because in comparison, I heard that North Caicos was like a metropolis compared to Provo.
If I can, Lyndon, getting back, can you speak a little bit about what spurred your interest in aviation? And what period in your life did this happen and why? Because you seem to take it on and just run with it.
Well, I think it came out of, part of it came out of necessity, and I was actually working at a bank and wanted to have the opportunity to go backwards and forward to the Dominican Republic. So I'm going to give you the short.
You care to tell us why?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the short version. So, and then I'll give you an autograph version of my book. But
Can I ask which bank you were working in?
I was at Barclays Bank at
And
the time.
who was the manager at that time?
At the time was Victor Eudoxie. He's the man that hired me, and Vince Palmer was the guy that was running the bank when I left.
Who was this?
In Grand Turk.
Grand Turk, okay.
Yeah. So I took, back then we used to take TCNA and go from Grand Turk to Puerto Plata. And then we would take a bus from Puerto Plata up to Santo Domingo, where my lovely lady resided. And my first trip was actually done I was with Dan Malcolm, the former banker and politician from South Caicos. So he took me there, and I remember that we had, I didn't meet my wife there, but they had a what's called a Tropicana. They used to have these Tropicana shows. And we were there for the Tropicana show, and being a young man at the time, having one or two drinks and dancing the bachata music, it really still resonates with me and makes me happy. I decided that I would stay on for a few more days. I ended up meeting my my girlfriend, who later became my wife. And so when I went back to Turks and Caicos, about every 2 weeks, I would be missing on a Friday. So my manager said to me, he says, "Look, Lyndon," I said, "why are you always missing?" And I said, "Well, I've got an affair. I've got business in the Dominican Republic." So he said to me, "Well, what can I do to help?" And I said, "Okay, fine. I need to get my private pilot's license so I can fly myself there." Got a loan. Went over to the States for a couple of weeks. I think it was about 3 weeks or so.
Was your oldest brother a pilot at this stage?
No, my oldest brother was, he was an air traffic controller at that time. And in later years, he was the one that would stay up and allow me to land just as before they shut the light off, coming in from the Dominican Republic. Because I'll go at 5 o'clock. As soon as clock struck 5, I would head out of the bank and I would be gone. But I then There was, we were at Gillies one Friday afternoon eating free fried fish and just drinking and golfing with everyone. And Jim Henry, actually, he came and he said, Lyndon, there's a billfish tournament. Why don't you take us out flying? And I said, okay, fine. I took him out. We took the door off the airplane, flew low and slow. He got some really good pictures. And when we came back, he says, well, what do I owe you? And I said, well, you know, I can't really charge you for this. Just give me something. And he said, okay, fine. He gave me $500. That was five of the crispest $100 that me or you would probably ever seen. And it was really good because at the time I made $1,122 for a full month's work in the bank. So I decided that I will quit. And at the time, you would just hang out at the airport, and we used to call it on the hustle, where you'd just be there and you'd ask anyone, well, where are you going? You know, that kind of stuff. And I was able to make a few runs, make a few bucks, went into Wednesday to make my deposit. The bank says, well, you know, we'll take your deposit, but you don't have any money. I said, well, I just deposited money. He said, no, that's going to go towards your loan as well. So I was left pretty much penniless. I did have $50 in my pocket, and I took my $50, went to the airport, and I bought $50 gas. Because I says, you know, if anything happens, at least I have gas in my airplane. I can roll the dice and make another $1. So I went ahead and did that. And then I got caught with civil aviation, who impressed on me the need to get an AOC, which is an air operator certificate. I later on went ahead and did that, and in February 6, 1992, as I got off an airplane in Grand Turk, they gave me an AOC. And ever since then, it's just been, you know, just growing the company, adapting it to the changes, not only with what's happening here in the Turks and Caicos, but some of the regional changes. And of course, most people that live in Caribbean understands the need for, I suppose, better Caribbean integration. There's certainly a natural flow of people between the islands just because of the geography and because of the connections that one island has to the other, whether it's family, whether it's, you know, history. You know, there's 1,000,001 reason why there's disconnection. So that was how I got started in aviation. And to be honest with you, I still enjoy it today as I did 27, 28 years ago.
So tell me, what has been one of your biggest challenge as an entrepreneur doing business in Turks and Caicos?
Well,
I mean, so is it? Do you think that in your experience, everything is being done to facilitate the growth and development of entrepreneurs like yourself, young Turks and Caicos Islanders who want to step out?
I'm not young anymore.
Well, yeah, but you were when you did.
Yes, I was.
And usually that's the hardest part. I mean, you're now seasoned. You've gone through quite a bit. You've learned a lot, but I would probably say, to be honest with you, that it's probably a lot harder for younger people to do what you did today.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I agree.
So speak to those challenges and the challenges that you had then and the challenges that you see now, because we still have to encourage young people to move out on their own and get into business.
Well, I think the number one challenge, Norman, and I think that's a great question. The number one challenge has been, first of all, being confident, because you know what you want to do, but somehow you get distracted by things around you that don't go exactly the way that you want them to go. And so it's quite easy to just abandon the project and then just say, well, I tried and it didn't work out, without trying harder. And I think that is certainly one issue. The other issue is, well, there's two more main issues, and I can go on with other issues forever. But access to capital is definitely a problem. Um, and you know, depending on your educational level, as you know, for me, I'm just a high school guy. Didn't do much more than that other than my pilot's course, and while I was at the bank, I did a correspondence course with banking. But having you know, mentors or people to bounce things off, having, you know, perhaps some little bit of some technical training in terms of the do's and the don'ts about business. Those are all things that I think will go a long way into helping people develop their own businesses, and most importantly, having the willpower to stay the course. Because as I said earlier, there's lots of reasons why you can just put your hand up and say, you know what, it's not going to work. But had I done that, then, you know, I probably wouldn't be here today. I think one of the earlier in the airline business, I don't remember what it is now, but there's some challenge that I had, and I went home crying to my mom, and I said, look, Mommy, I have this problem. And she said to me, well, what is the problem? I says, and I repeated it again. She says, so what have you done? And I started saying, well, I don't know what to do. And she said, well, that's the problem right there. She says, you know, you need to go and consider how it is that you solve this problem. And she says, you know, and if in thinking how you solve it, you go over it, you go under it, you go around it. And if you're unable to do any of that, you make a few steps back. And if you saw how she gave me that, you know, the physical side of it, and you just go a few steps back, and you come up and you bust it on. And that is, I think, a very important lesson. Sometimes when you take a few steps back, you begin to see a different perspective on things. And having a different perspective on things, a lot of times allow you to see things that you would not have seen with with your face right at it. And I think those are good. Those things have served me very well.
We'll take a break to pay the bills, and then we'll come back, and I'm sure John has something he wants to get into with you. Welcome back to Conversations with our special guest, Lyndon Gardner, founder and CEO of Intercaribbean Airways. Now, as we went to break, John Phillips, the politician among us, was just about to throw you into the deep end. Go ahead, John.
I was actually going to make a comment on, we talked about your number of personnel, and training obviously has to be an incredible portion of that work. I probably have more experience of your airline over the last 8 years or so than anyone else in the room. I haven't got my frequent flyer card yet, by the way. But
I'll have it delivered tomorrow.
But I did have an amusing experience a couple of months back, because obviously staff are trained to react in certain ways. And when members of Parliament arrive and there's a queue, very often the lady at the desk will print off the ticket and come on over here. And she did that to me one day, and I walked up and she said, Honourable Phillips, here's your ticket. Can I see your ID, please? And I said, you just printed my ticket and gave it to me. She said, I know, but it's company rules. I have to see your ID. So.
Well, traveling in the islands now has become, I suppose, like everywhere else, we've just had in the last few years beefing up of the security protocols, and actually a new Overseas Territories Air Regulations, OTA 178, which deals with security. And even if they've seen you a million times, you think that it'll be the old days when you say, well, I know John, let's just put him on the plane. But some of those things are mandatory, and then we encourage our staff to follow all the protocols so that it's never missed because of fuminology or because of being accustomed to doing any one thing.
No, I have to say, your staff on board and desk-wise, you have an excellent staff. You must be doing something.
Well,
you can tell the quality of management by the quality of staff and the loyalty of staff. That's
thank you.
a huge thing in the business.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Quick question on a different note. Time lapse between when you started out in your small single engine plane versus today. And I think, what advice would you have for a new person, a young person who's coming fresh out of college or university, which you yourself didn't have the privilege of attaining, as you said earlier? What advice would you give to them, especially when it comes to the allocation or the finding of capital and stuff like that, and to start up a business? Because I do think, and I could be wrong, I do think there are various businesses here, like especially in the business that you're in, that will the way that you was able to start back some 25 years ago or so.
27
and a half years ago, forgive me. It's much different today, whereby you was able to start without an initial capital. But today, that person coming out want to start up in the business in not necessarily in the same business that you have, but a similar business that is well needed. Do you have any advice for that person?
Well, I do have some advice, and I think one of the things is to, first of all, know what you want to do. Second of all, create a plan surrounding that. In terms of access to funding, it's not very easy, and sometimes you have to be creative. Not avoiding your questions, because I'll come back to the answer, but in my case, I can tell you one of the single biggest injection that I got was access to Crown land, because I was able to get a parcel of land, build a house, out of my pocket for the most part, and then I was able to go to the bank and finance it and put the roof on. And once that was done, then I went in and financed it yet again, and using the value to buy an airplane. Now that requires some innovation. It requires a lot of determination in terms of creating the right business plan and ensuring that you follow through. Some of those opportunities are removed from today's world, and I think that if we're, and I know this is not a political show, and I don't want to be political in any way, shape, or form, but I think the government of the day must look for or must provide certain avenues for financing for small and medium-sized business. And I think that those people that tap into that small and medium-sized business, they must be responsible. Because I know a lot of people believe that once you get government money, it's free money and you just spend it and don't pay it back. And that's really not the case. And so you have to start off with a little endowment, a little bit of money, and you have to run it prudently enough to grow it so that the tradition carries on, and every cycle you end up with a little bit more money to spend or to invest with people. And I don't have all the answers for it, but I know having access to capital is a major impediment with people getting involved in business.
I think the government, probably 2015, the micro, small, and medium company did take a step towards it, but the next step has to be to try to make it more comfortable, to try to make it more attractive for overseas venture capital to back Turks and Caicos Island business. And that still seems to be a stumbling block. We don't really have aggressive banking here. In fact, very often it's the other side.
Yeah, I think we have I think we have smaller savings and loans organizations.
It's I don't know, but it's a step we have to take. You're in a very capital intensive business.
Very much so.
So you've had to parlay the one to the next to the next to the next. And I agree that that's how it should be. One has to struggle to appreciate where you're going. But at the same time, it's very difficult for a young person today to get the starting point. And we said earlier, or you said earlier, it was easier in your day than it is now.
Oh, yes.
And one of the reasons for that is you were able to enter a field which was fairly open. You could create a business that didn't have direct competition. Nowadays, it's more difficult for a youngster to actually find that business and develop it without having early access to capital to put the building on the ground, to start manufacturing, to do whatever it is. And it's not easy. We are a small country, but we're a very successful country. And we must broadcast that, whether through Invest DCI or through government endeavors. We have to get the message overseas that this is a good place, a safe place, a good place to invest. And I think that ingredient is missing at the moment.
I think you did have competition, and I think there's something special about you. And you had competition that was sponsored by financing from outside. I remember TCNA were bought by, I think it was a Texas company, and ran into trouble. But I think the way you've done it is actually your focus on it. You talked earlier about your passion. I think you started with a passion in Santo Domingo, and then, but you also had to get there. So I think you developed probably an equal and a stronger passion, perhaps. And it comes down to you. And I remember in Cuba, I mean, we had a lovely day, and then I'd heard when you got back to the States, and you woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning because things were going round in your head, and I have to be in Florida to do something. So you have to be, I think, constantly you're thinking things through, and you're reacting to them, like your mum said, well, what are you doing about it? And I think that lesson stayed with you as well. So I think you had some very good mentors.
Well, Doc, one of the other things which I didn't say was, a lot of times you want to do things, and you can, in your head, you can think of a million reasons why you're not going to do it. And I just choose to focus on the positives and not the negatives. And if I see a ray of light of any positiveness, I figure out how I can make that brighter, as opposed to saying, well, here's one positive and two negatives. Let me work on the worst case scenarios of how those negatives are going to affect me. Because it is not just words that, negativity takes twice as much effort as one positive deed. It's reality.
Can you share with us two of the things that I remember in that conversation through that day in Cuba? And one was how important the area regionally of Puerto Rico and BVI was, and how that came to impact your business. And the other thing is how you do business and get integrated with the giants such as British Airways. Can you share that with us?
Well, that's on the BVI, which represents a fair large volume of our business now. I was going to the BVI just prospecting to see, what we can find and how we can continue to expand our business. The focus for us is really being the air bridge between the entire Caribbean. And in getting there, I remember I flew on Cape Air, which was a Cessna 402, $500 one way. It certainly did, because I know what we charge is in these parts, and between Puerto Rico and BVI was really only the same as from here to Grand Turk. and we get, on a good day, we get $120 round trip, which I think is very reasonable, more than reasonable, but that's another conversation for the next time you invite me on here.
We'll talk price.
But going there, in the middle of the afternoon, one single pilot and the weather bad, and I was like, wow, if this is what these people have to endure, then they would love in the Caribbean. So we got there, met with all the relevant people, decided that this was doable. We had checked all the passenger numbers before, and we decided that we will do a service. And then what we did was you immediately just rationalize the price. We didn't go there trying to undercut anybody. We went there trying to give people, look, this is a fair price, this is a fair product, and this is what we have to get. Within 6 or 7 months, we had gotten most of the market, and today we have, the better part of almost 70% of the market. So that took, a bit of, first of all, some timing of our flights to make sure that we had better schedules. The equipment that we put on the route were superior than what was being operated. And I think more importantly, we didn't gouge people. We said, look, we give you a fair price anytime, walk up, round trip, $350 instead of $500 one way. And I think people really appreciated that, and they showed their loyalty. It's amazing how people, would warm up to you if they think you're being fair with them.
Mm. I think back in the days, you had BW, British West Indian Airways, and you had Liat. Neither of them really provided a good service.
No.
And you seem to have overcome that. You now have a bigger spread than either of those had.
Yes, we do. And I think a lot of it has to do with the timing of our flights. It's critical. It's critical in terms of timing because very often traveling around the Caribbean, you can lose a lot of time. And I suppose the whole business of airline is selling people, giving you your time back to do what you want to do with it.
There's something to do with government ownership as well, because those are old names, and Air Jamaica's another one, and that aren't those companies partly government owned and government financed? Liat, and do they have less flexibility as you as owner and chairman?
I think they have more flexibility because they just spend the money. I have to produce the money to spend.
Right, fair enough. Okay.
But in all fairness to them, I think Liat has, in my view, and my personal view, they have some set of challenges that is unique to them. Mm-hmm. First of all, just having 6 governments as shareholders is one of them, and whoever's going to put the most money in, and they demand that they get the service, which may not be in the best interest of the company. I think at our level, being a smaller, more agile company, we're able to make quick decisions. Not only make those decisions, but affect those decisions, and they go a long way into helping us to have a sustainable business.
And how did you get into bed with the big boys, with British Airways? And you integrate seemingly very well. You seem to be a carrier of choice when they get into the Antigua and the destinations they go to. How have you achieved that?
Well, we achieved it by Doc. I think over the last year, we've had some instances where our on-time performance has not been as stellar as it used to be. But it's amazing how people forgot that the last 15 years before that in a row, we were running between 86 and 93% on-time performance. And I can get to why the on-time performance have dropped. A lot of it has to do with our business in Turks and Caicos and being able to get in and out quickly. I'll come back on your show to do that next time.
Okay.
But I think the first step started by having a schedule that synchronized with what British Airways was doing.
But did you create that around their schedule? I mean, you must have had an insight to do that.
We did. Well, what we do when we go to markets is, first of all, we look at the opportunity, we look at the number of passengers traveling, and then we look at what everyone else is doing. Because if you just go in and do what everyone else is doing, you just become part of the crowd.
Yep.
And our strategy is to actually, be trend-setting, to make things different. And as it turned out, a lot of people were, say, going to the BVIs or going to St. Kitts. They'll fly into BA with down in Antigua, and because everybody else left before, they had an opportunity to get out.
Overnight or another half
So they
day.
end up having to overnight in Antigua, and then on the way back, they'll end up having to leave the BVI quite early in the morning and spend the whole day at the airport in Antigua, when they really should be spending their day having the last margarita on the beach. And so we did our schedule that was timed very nicely for the BA flight coming and going. And in fact, we repeated that in Jamaica. And they saw us as a better option. Our on-time performance helped them to make that decision. They made a decision that, wow, you guys would be the perfect interline for us. And now we have a full interline agreement with them where we are transporting 20 to 40,000 people a year just on that agreement alone. But what is more important than that is the fact that BA tickets or our ticketing is done on BA stock. So we have the ability to sell tickets in a lot of other places that a small airline of our size would normally not be able to. And that's been a very good benefit of having that connection with BA. Plus, the other thing is, when you can tell people, well, I've got an interline agreement with BA, then everyone know that you must be a serious carrier, because BA wouldn't be dealing with fly-by-night operations.
We're aware that you're rather a special person, Lyndon, but I think you actually started off and you were talking about Intercaribbean being a family. And I know that you hold two, at least, of your employees in very high regard. I think one as a strategist and one as a FBO operator. Do you want to mention anything about the parts they've played in your business?
Well, they've played and continue to play a very useful role. I mean, Doc, let's just face it, no man is an island. Beginning with my mom and my sister and Debbie at the FBO, there's a saying that behind every successful man, there's a better woman. They've really been very instrumental in my success. And indeed, I think I was fortunate to assemble a very good team of people. Having a good team of people that actually believe in the idea and the ideals and what it is that you're doing makes my work and my life a lot easier, because those people that are on the ground dealing with the things from day to day, they see a lot more than I would see by just passing through and going to my corporate office and spending the day, trying to do those things. Again, on the airline side, I've got some very good people, my strategists, my marketing people, above all my CEO. These are all great people that have made excellent contributions to the company and to the development of the company. And so, again, as a leader or someone that is on the forefront, it is important that you recognize the qualities in these people and you allow them to shine.
Let's go back to your success in the Eastern Caribbean. It appears to me that, and I could be wrong, that you seem to be connecting with the international sort of airline community. Is this saying that your intention is to move more internationally and have more of an international airline that moves around the Caribbean and further out of the Caribbean sphere? I mean, I consider you an international airline now because you move it all around the Caribbean. But are you now focusing on
Well, I
Do you
think-
see that as a future in your company?
Well, Anil, the thing is, I've never ruled anything out. But the medium and short term focus is not to doing anything outside of the Caribbean for the moment. Now, you know, it depends on your definition of the Caribbean. My definition of the Caribbean is everywhere from Florida down to Belize and all the way south down to Guyana. They're all part of the Caribbean, part of my Caribbean. Yeah. So we've got a wide sphere of area to cover. And let's face it, besides the legacy government-owned carriers, there's really no, I think we're the only, well, we're certainly the major private enterprise that are involved in air transportation in the region. Just to give you an example, last year there's 4.2 million people that move around the Caribbean. We carried just over 400,000 people. So we're talking about 10% of the business. And I can tell you, we're doing, you know, between 50 and 60 flights a day. And you know, it's a huge undertaking, but more importantly, there's room and there's scope for a lot more development. We're certainly provided, or we've shown that having this connection in the Northern Caribbean is quite useful. Before we started, take for instance, getting between Santo Domingo and Kingston, Jamaica, it would take 7 hours if you were going on American Airlines, or 9 hours if you're going on Copa. That's via Miami or Panama. Well, now you can do that in an hour and a half on a direct flight from Santo Domingo to Kingston, or if you come through Turks and Caicos, you can do it in just under 3 hours, right? And the fact that by doing it, now someone doesn't need to stress themselves about having a visa and planning, you know, a whole day, particularly in the case of a businessman, when time is money, and losing the whole day and trying to do so. So, you know, there's still a lot more that can be done. And we're focused on trying to grow, obviously, sustainably, because you can take the view that, you know, I can try and do everything, and then at the end of the day, you don't necessarily cover, or you don't become, or you're not a sustainable enterprise. Or you can take it in steps and you kind of grow and continue to grow. I think aviation is one of perhaps the most regulated, probably after the medical field, Doc.
Well,
Or neck and neck.
I think the medical field is getting more regulated now that they've actually developed the HRA, the Health Regulatory Authority, which they've had I think the regulations are in now. But I think the airline industry has been pretty heavily regulated
Yes.
all the way through.
Yes,
and you've had your arguments with them at some stage in your history, I think.
Yes, well, you know, I mean, my argument has been, there's one thing that I'm very passionate about, Doc, is I'm very passionate about safety, because particularly with an airplane, there's never a second chance, right? And so, you know, that's one thing that you have to do, but then there are other things that I think a regulator must consider. And those are you know, obviously the cost of doing business. You can't just make a regulation because it suits you without considering the cost. There has to be a proper balance after the safety of factors is taken into consideration. And so, you know, in dealing with some of the issues that we've seen, it's not only been, you know, well, the safety aside, but trying to get them to see how it is to make running a business more efficient has sometimes been challenging.
You said something just a few minutes ago where you described your scope, your scale. And it put me in mind of something I chased early 90s with a large company out of US. They wanted to base freight forwarding, flying in from New York, from various destinations to here, purely for freight. Because they said if you put a pin, if you put a compass point here in Turks and Caicos and draw a 600-mile circle, that's a key area that they can't easily service from any of their existing circulation bases.
I would agree.
Do you ever consider that? We fought. We couldn't get
Maybe
the
the
deal
Colombians had considered it in reverse some years ago.
done. we fought quite hard to try and get them introduced, and Grand Turk administration at the time just couldn't see the worth. They couldn't see the value.
Well, incidentally, there are, for instance, the Dominican Republic they're building a $28 million freight facility in Santo Domingo. In Jamaica, they're talking about creating the hub of the Caribbean for freight and for passengers. I think that, Turks and Caicos is, we're out front anyway. The Dominican Republic, even with 13 million people, Jamaica with 3.5 or 4 million people, they don't have an airline, certainly of doing what we're doing. And I think we're fortunate in the Turks and Caicos to have an airline. And sometimes I think the thinking of the people involved in aviation from a governmental standpoint is very short
limited.
Yes,
very
very limited.
blinker.
And short.
Because even in the 90s, the money, the volumes, just to serve that 600-mile circle, the volume of traffic was huge.
Yes.
It would have been a great thing for Grand Turk, for instance, back then.
Well, 2 years ago we had we pop up on the radar of a huge U.S. freight company that does business throughout the Caribbean, and what they said was, look, and there's a lot of positives about the Turks and Caicos, and they say, look, we can fly a wide-body jet in here from Miami or wherever. And then if you have a fleet of airplanes that you can fly to all the islands, then that'll just make it a lot easier.
That was the whole concept
yes.
that we talked about in the 90s.
Yes.
But it was coming direct out of New York, Washington, major cities further
Yes.
north. They didn't need to stop in Miami.
Exactly. And I think it would be a good business that we can develop, and certainly would mean a lot of job opportunities for people in the islands, and also opportunity for government to secure revenues.
Absolutely. Oh, there was no question about revenue being paid, the landing fees,
Yes.
the handling fees,
And hiring people to do this.
and all the people that you need to do it. It's a huge operation.
Yeah. So, Lyndon. Yeah, hi, Bentley.
Bentley speaks.
This has been a really exciting conversation with you. But I think before you go, before we end the show, talk to us about the future. Where the future of Intercaribbean as an airline? Where do you see Intercaribbean airline in the next 10 years?
Well, that's another good question, Norman. And I will just tell you this. In 10 years' time, there's only 3 things that I want to have that's well known in the Caribbean. And 2 of them will probably beat Intercaribbean. The number 1 is the Cross, and the other one is Coca-Cola. But the Caribbean, by the nature, you have to move around the islands with an airplane. It's, I've seen, I've been in touch with people like the World Bank, who've just, sometime in the recent past, spent a lot of money on studies, saying of how to get fast ferries, just how to create connectivity. Because the
islands, those small, they're too far apart.
Yes.
And we're separated by deep oceans.
Yes.
And so I totally agree with you. I mean, you don't have to do studies to understand it. That's really not going to work.
I told them
the studies are a waste of time.
I told them they could have given us the money that they spent on the study.
No, absolutely.
But that was gone by the time.
Yeah.
What I see, Norman, is I can see growing the Turks and Caicos into a hub. I don't know if you know, but 15 years ago, or maybe a little longer than that, Copa Airlines in Panama was flying single-engine Cessna Caravans. They now have 110 gates in Panama, and I think they have like 130 airplanes. And they're just, it's a huge enterprise that employs a lot of people, that brings a lot of value to the economy of Panama. One thing that helps any economy is connectivity, because if people can't get to a place, then they're likely to say, well, maybe I should try someplace else. But where there's this connectivity, it makes it a lot easier. What I'm hoping to see, and what our business plan is and business focus is to actually continue and develop where you would end up with our hub here and another hub somewhere in the Eastern Caribbean, and then we have basically distributing in that area, distributing in this area, and then a flight a couple times a day between the hubs. That's very achievable. It's something that's really needed. When I look also, a larger and larger portion of our business is actually self-funded multi-destination vacationists. So someone will come and they will come in to say Turks and Caicos, but they may want to leave from the Dominican Republic or from Jamaica. If you look at it, all of the carriers coming from North America and Europe, for the most part, they fly to a lot of these islands. And so there's nothing wrong or with you flying into one island, say that's your favorite island, spending a couple of days there, and then using a service such as ours to get to another island. So I think that we have a great opportunity for expansion. I think the Caribbean is where we need to continue to dedicate our focus and our growth activities. And I think that it'll be very rewarding for us, and it'll be rewarding for the Caribbean as a whole, because I think the more that you can move people around the region, then the better of an opportunity there is to spread the wealth amongst the other islands.
Okay. And before we go, one more thing. Turks and Caicos will always be the hub of Intercaribbean, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Absolutely. And you have me. You have witnesses and a camera.
Okay, great. This has been another great conversation, and we thank our guest, Lyndon Gardner, for joining us. Good night.